Mick Jagger was crowned a knight by Buckingham Palace, while Sable Starr was buried and forgotten in a Nevada desert. Behind the glamorous myth of the 1972 Rolling Stones tour hides a cold, highly financed reality. It was a meticulously organized machine designed to incorporate a 15-year-old youth from the streets and bring her to a 29-year-old superstar. A profound systemic failure occurred in plain sight. This is the story of how the world chose to applaud the celebrity and overlook the affected. Sable Starr was the ideal target for this extreme power imbalance. Searching for an identity in Los Angeles, she lacked the boundaries and legal awareness of an adult. Being brought into the inner circle of the band did not register as a danger. She simply felt she was chosen. The entertainment infrastructure of the city easily accommodated this dynamic. Mick Jagger operated in various zones, from luxury hotel suites to VIP lounges, where conventional rules were quietly suspended. When the tour established its headquarters, management did not just rent the property, they took absolute control of the entire environment. Jagger sat at the apex of this controlled territory. He did not need to walk the streets of the Sunset Strip to find Sable Starr. He did not need to approach her in a public setting where witnesses could intervene or authorities could ask questions. He operated with the distance and insulation of a corporate executive. The invitation and arrival of the individual were tasks delegated to the lower tiers of the organization. The men who handled these logistics were not musicians. They were fixers. They were large, imposing men employed specifically to manage the physical reality of the tour. Their job was crowd control, risk management, and specific VIP logistics. In the summer of 1972, identifying a 15-year-old youth and bringing her to a 29-year-old man was treated with the same operational efficiency as securing the stage equipment or coordinating the flight manifests. Sable Starr, at 15, was about to be processed by this machine. She was about to be moved from the public sphere into a heavily monitored, heavily financed blind spot where the statutes of California regarding the welfare of youth simply ceased to exist. The operation was about to move into its physical phase. The operation commenced in the shadows of the Sunset Strip. The individual was located not with a romantic gesture, but with a calculated logistical maneuver. Mick Jagger did not descend to the street level. He did not mingle in the crowded bars or stand on the pavement outside the venues. He remained in the secure, elevated perimeter of his penthouse suite. The process of bringing in the 15-year-old youth was a task assigned to the tour's logistics apparatus. These were not roadies. They were professional fixers, private contractors, and specialists hired by the tour's management company. They wore tailored suits or heavy tour jackets. They were paid exorbitant daily rates to ensure the machinery of the tour ran without friction. On this night, the friction was the standard legal boundaries, and their job was to bypass it. The logistics team located Sable Starr. There was no formal introduction. There was a nod, a hand placed gently on a shoulder, and a quiet guiding away from the public eye. She was not guided toward the main entrance of the hotel. The lobby was heavily monitored. It was packed with journalists, fans, and uniformed officers of the Los Angeles Police Department. Walking a 15-year-old girl through that environment was a liability. It left a trail. It created witnesses. Instead, the entourage marched the teenager toward the rear of the building. They moved her down a concrete ramp into the subterranean parking garage. The air smelled of exhaust fumes and damp concrete. This was the service entrance, a space designed for garbage trucks, laundry deliveries, and maintenance crews. It was a utilitarian zone deliberately hidden from the glamorous facade of the hotel. It was the perfect conduit for discreet arrivals. The men flanked her. They formed a physical barricade, shielding her from any stray line of sight. They walked her past industrial dumpsters and stacked pallets. They approached a heavy steel fire door. One handler pulled it open, checking the perimeter before directing the girl inside. The heavy door closed shut, cutting off the noise of the street. They stood in a bare, fluorescent-lit service corridor. At the end of the hall was the service elevator. This elevator was essentially a large metal cage. Its interior was scratched and dented from years of transporting heavy equipment and room service carts. It was entirely separate from the passenger elevators used by the paying guests. It required a special key to operate, a key held by the hotel staff and the band's top coordinators. The handlers ushered Sable Starr into the metal box. One of them inserted the key and pressed the button for the top floor. The heavy doors slid shut with a mechanical clank. The elevator began its slow ascent. Inside this ascending metal cage, the psychological severing was initiated. A 15-year-old girl was standing shoulder to shoulder with large, silent men. The disparity in physical strength was absolute. It was in this confined space that the final remnants of her autonomy were stripped away. The handlers requested her belongings. They instructed her to hand over her identification. They cited security protocols and the strict privacy requirements of the band. She complied. She had no choice. The moment she handed over her belongings, she ceased to be a citizen operating under standard protections. She lost her ability to prove who she was. She lost her ability to call for help. Her connection to the outside world was severed. The collection of her identity was a deliberate tactic designed to enforce total compliance. Without money, without identification, and without communication devices, she was completely reliant on the men who managed her environment. The service elevator bypassed every floor. It did not stop for other guests. It was a direct, uninterrupted vertical transport. The logistics team operated with the cold efficiency of a unit escorting a VIP guest. They were not facilitating a party. They were completing an assignment. The Los Angeles Police Department stood guard outside the building. They were deployed to manage the crowds and maintain public order. They set up barricades. They redirected traffic. The police presence was designed to protect the Rolling Stones from the public. In doing so, the police inadvertently functioned as an outer security ring for the band's highly questionable operations. The badges and uniforms outside provided a shield of legitimacy, while inside the concrete walls, a youth was being moved up a service shaft. The system functioned exactly as the tour accountants had planned. The massive influx of capital generated by the tour effectively neutralized the local law enforcement apparatus. The elevator continued its climb. Mick Jagger waited above. He maintained a state of absolute plausible deniability. He was insulated by layers of management, promoters, and personnel. If the authorities breached the hotel, if an inquiry occurred, the handlers would take the fall. The logistics team would claim they were acting independently. The record executives would claim ignorance. The corporate structure of the tour was designed to protect the chief executive at all costs. Jagger could sit on his sofa, drink in hand, entirely detached from the grim reality of the subterranean concrete, the steel doors, and the collected ID cards. The machinery of the operation was flawless. The risks were calculated and mitigated. The guest had been identified, brought in, and isolated. The transport phase was nearing its conclusion. The metal box was approaching the designated level. The standard rules of the state of California remained far below, useless on the pavement. The elevator slowed, the gears grinding as it reached the summit of the building. The mechanical groan of the service elevator ceased. The heavy metal doors slid apart with a harsh scrape. Sable Starr stepped out of the raw steel cage and onto a floor buried beneath an ocean of thick, sound-absorbing carpet. The transition was absolute. She had left the dirty, utilitarian concrete of the service shaft and entered a realm of suffocating luxury. This was the penthouse level. This was the fortress. The atmosphere changed instantly. The air conditioning was turned down to a frigid temperature, a deliberate tactic to keep the occupants alert during intense lifestyle cycles. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke, heavy cologne, and the sharp tang of the environment. The hallway was silent. The normal sounds of a hotel, the chatter of guests, the rattle of housekeeping carts did not exist here. This space had been entirely cleansed of the general public. The tour management entirely locked down the top 2 floors, establishing a secure exclusion zone. The record label backing the Rolling Stones tour did not merely rent the penthouse suite. They bought out the entire floor. They bought out the floor immediately below it to ensure no noise complaints could be filed by civilian guests. They created a vertical exclusion zone. By doing so, they effectively suspended the standard operations of the building. They established a sovereign territory within the borders of California, a place where the band's tour manager was the sole executive authority. The architecture of the hotel was weaponized against the 15-year-old girl. A hotel floor is designed with limited points of entry and exit. The tour personnel fortified these choke points. Large men in tailored suits stood at the end of every corridor. They blocked the fire escape stairwells. They monitored the passenger elevator banks. Their physical presence was an insurmountable barrier. Sable Starr was a youth standing in a sealed perimeter. She could not press a button and go down to the lobby. The passenger elevators were restricted, requiring a master key that had been managed by the band's team. She could not take the stairs because the men monitoring the doors would simply intercept her. The heavy windows in the suites were sealed shut, bolted into the frames to prevent extreme incidents. There was no simple way out. The moment she stepped off the service elevator, she transitioned from a guest into a heavily restricted dependent. The personnel ushered her down the silent, heavily carpeted hallway. They stopped in front of double oak doors. A handler knocked twice, a coded rhythm, before turning the brass handle. He pushed the door open and motioned for the teenager to enter. She walked into the main suite. The blackout curtains were drawn tight, sealing out the California sun. Dozens of lamps cast a dim amber glow across the room. The space was littered with the debris of extreme wealth and extreme consumption. Half-empty bottles of imported liquor cluttered the mahogany tables. Overflowing ashtrays stained the upholstery. The room was populated by handlers, accountants, and sycophants. They were all adults. They were all complicit. They looked at the 15-year-old girl and saw nothing abnormal. She was just another arrival, an expected amenity arranged by the chief executive. Inside the suite, the presence of a 15-year-old was treated as entirely normal by the surrounding handlers and management. The overwhelming atmosphere and alcohol in a heavily monitored room quickly disoriented the teenager. Her independence was heavily restricted in an environment where adult professionals conducted tour business around her, entirely ignoring the stark reality of her age. This massive cover-up required the participation of the local workforce. A hotel of that size requires a constant stream of domestic labor. Maids, room service waiters, and maintenance workers moved through the building. They were working-class Americans, paid minimum wage to clean up the messes left by the wealthy. A maid pushing a cart on a lower floor received a call on her radio. She was dispatched to the VIP level to deliver fresh towels and clean a spill in the main suite. She took the service elevator. She passed the security checkpoint. She knocked on the heavy oak door. A handler opened it a fraction. The maid stepped inside. She saw the environment on the glass tables. She saw the empty bottles. And she saw the girl. The maid was a mother. She knew what a teenager looked like. She saw the quiet distress disguised as compliance in the girl's eyes. She knew instantly and unequivocally that a profoundly inappropriate situation was taking place in that room. The girl was 15. The man was nearly 30. The maid lowered her head. She went to the bathroom, stacked the fresh towels, and wiped down the marble counters. She walked back toward the door to leave. Before she could exit into the hallway, a man in a sharp suit intercepted her. He was an accountant for the tour. He did not speak. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick roll of cash. It was the slush fund. It was capital specifically allocated for the protection of reputation. He peeled off 3 crisp, brand-new $100 bills. In 1972, $300 was more than a maid earned in a month of scrubbing toilets. He folded the bills and pressed them firmly into the palm of her hand. He leaned in close. His voice was quiet, polite, and completely terrifying. He told her that the hotel management placed the highest priority on the absolute privacy of their VIP guests. He mentioned her supervisor by name. The implication hung in the refrigerated air. If she went to the authorities, she would be fired before she finished dialing the phone. Her family would lose their income. She would be blacklisted from the hospitality industry. If she kept her mouth shut and forgot the face of the overwhelmed child on the sofa, she got to keep the $300. The maid tightened her grip on the cash. She nodded. She walked out the door and pushed her cart down the silent hallway. She chose her livelihood over the safety of a stranger's child. This transaction happened dozens of times a day. It was the systematic financial arrangement of the American working class. Room service waiters who delivered trays of food to the suite were handed massive cash tips to ignore the underage girls sitting in the corners. Bellhops were tipped heavily to look the other way when the personnel guided an incapacitated teenager to a waiting car. The blind eye reached the highest levels of the hotel's administration. The general manager knew exactly what was happening on the penthouse floor. He received regular reports from the staff, but the hotel was part of a massive corporate conglomerate. The presence of the Rolling Stones generated unprecedented revenue. The bar receipts were astronomical. The publicity was invaluable. The tour promoters handed the hotel management envelopes thick with cash, euphemistically labeled as incidental damage deposits. The hotel administration made a calculated financial decision. The profit margin outweighed the moral imperative. They issued quiet directives to their staff. Do not bother the VIPs. Do not call law enforcement under any circumstances. If there is a problem, call the band's internal management team. The hotel actively surrendered its legal obligation to protect minors on its premises. They became an accessory to a sprawling, highly restrictive network. Sable Starr remained secluded behind the heavy oak doors. The blackout curtains stayed closed. The sun rose and set over the Pacific Ocean, but inside the suite, time dissolved into a continuous disorienting loop. The machinery of isolation functioned perfectly. The local workforce was incentivized. The corporate management was complicit. The perimeter held firm. A 15-year-old girl was secluded in a room with a 29-year-old man, entirely abandoned by the society that was built to protect her. The sun did not exist on the penthouse floor. Time lost its standard measurements. It was no longer divided into day and night. It was divided by the arrival of fresh ice, the delivery of room service carts, and the intense activities on mirrored tables. Inside the sealed suite, Sable Starr was severed from the natural rhythms of the outside world. This sensory deprivation was a highly effective method of control. When a person cannot see the sky, they lose their anchor. When a 15-year-old girl is kept awake for long hours through the intense lifestyle and sheer overwhelming pressure, her cognitive functions break down. She stops looking for an exit. She simply focuses on surviving the next hour. The adults in the room normalized the unacceptable situation. This was the most insidious aspect of her isolation. If Jagger had brought her into a dark basement, the violation would have been obvious. But this was a brightly lit luxury suite. Men in expensive suits sat in plush armchairs, discussing million-dollar gross revenues, stadium capacities, and logistics for the upcoming tour dates in Texas. They drank imported champagne. They spoke in calm, measured, professional tones. They conducted high-level corporate business while a youth sat on the sofa, waiting to be acknowledged by the chief executive. The normalization functioned as a psychological weapon. When a youth looks around a room and sees 20 adults acting as if nothing is wrong, she begins to doubt her own reality. She internalizes the madness. She convinces herself that this must be how the world works at this echelon of society. The silence of the accountants, the managers, and the handlers formed a unified front of gaslighting. They did not look at her with pity. They looked at her with total indifference. She was a fixture. She was an amenity provided by the venue, no different from the fresh towels or the complimentary fruit basket. But a tour of this magnitude required constant promotion. The operation could not remain entirely sealed. The public relations machine demanded fuel. The music press had to be fed. The heavy oak doors of the suite were occasionally unlocked to admit a very specific type of outsider. Music journalists from prominent magazines were granted exclusive access. These were the gatekeepers of rock culture. They held the power to shape public perception. They could crown kings or destroy reputations. The management apparatus shifted gears. The journalists were not moved up the service elevator. They were escorted through the main lobby. They were given VIP passes. They were ushered into the penthouse with professional courtesy. They crossed the threshold into the sovereign territory of the Rolling Stones. These journalists were the supposed watchdogs of society. They were writers who prided themselves on their countercultural edge, their investigative grit, and their commitment to the truth. They walked into the suite. They saw Mick Jagger, and they saw the 15-year-old girl sitting silently in the corner. They did not pick up the telephone and dial the authorities. They did not demand to see the girl's identification. They did not ask where her parents were. They took out their notebooks and they sat down. The betrayal by the press was absolute. The journalists were compromised the moment they accepted the backstage pass. In the ecosystem of 1970s rock journalism, access was the ultimate currency. To get the cover story, to get the exclusive interview with Mick Jagger, a writer had to play by the rules dictated by the band's management. Exposing a highly concerning operation operating out of the penthouse would guarantee the revocation of that access. It would end a journalist's career in the music industry. The writers made a swift, calculating, and cowardly moral compromise. They chose their bylines over the safety of a child. Jagger controlled these interviews with calculating charm. He sat opposite the reporters, articulate and composed, discussing his songwriting process, his blues influences, and the exhaustion of the road. The journalists furiously scribbled down his quotes. They drank his liquor. They laughed at his jokes. They basked in the proximity to immense power. The presence of an isolated youth in the same room was treated as a piece of edgy atmospheric background detail. It added to the mythos. It proved the danger and the excess of the Rolling Stones. The journalists did not just ignore the reality, they actively participated in a massive cover-up. They returned to their editorial offices and typed out sprawling thousands of word features. They had to explain the presence of these young girls in the hotel rooms of adult rock stars. They could not use the words unbalanced dynamic. They could not use the words systematic isolation. Those words invite federal investigations. Those words destroy billion-dollar touring corporations. Instead, the press invented a new vocabulary. They weaponized language to protect the powerful figure. They coined the term baby groupie. It was a linguistic masterstroke of narrative shifting. The word groupie carries a specific connotation. It implies agency. It implies a conscious, voluntary lifestyle choice made by an adult woman who aggressively pursues musicians for status and access. By attaching the word baby to the front of it, The journalists acknowledged the undeniable youth of the individuals, but entirely erased the severe violation. They turned a disturbing reality into a fashion statement. The press painted Sable Starr not as a vulnerable youth restricted in a hotel suite, but as a savvy, precocious scenester. They described her clothing. They described her makeup. They gave her titles. They called her the Queen of the Sunset Strip. They wrote articles detailing her supposed conquests, framing her as an active participant, an insider in her own right, who collected rock stars like trophies. This media narrative was a total inversion of reality. It shifted the burden of responsibility from the 29-year-old multimillionaire who controlled the rooms straight onto the shoulders of the 15-year-old girl who had her identification held. The magazines told the American public that this was not severe mistreatment. This was a new hip subculture. This was the avant-garde of the cultural revolution. The typewriter became an instrument for the avoidance of accountability. The reporters acted as an unpaid public relations wing for a highly restrictive operation. They provided the ultimate shield for Mick Jagger. If the authorities ever came knocking, the record executives could simply point to the leading music magazines. They could argue that the girl was a famous fixture of the scene, a willing participant in a documented subculture. The media had preemptively built the legal defense for the personnel. Inside the suite, Sable Starr was entirely cut off from the outside world, but she would eventually see these magazines. She would read the articles. She would see her own name printed in glossy ink, surrounded by the rhetoric of empowerment and rebellion. The psychological damage inflicted by this media campaign was catastrophic. When a youth is being manipulated behind closed doors, her only hope is that the outside world will recognize the wrongness of the situation and intervene. But the press did the opposite. The press validated the situation. The press told the 15-year-old girl that what was happening to her was not an ethical breach, but an achievement. They built a gilded cage for her mind. They convinced her that her situation was a form of royalty. She was taught to wear her situation as a badge of honor. She learned to project the image the magazines demanded. She posed for the cameras. She smiled. She played the role of the untouchable queen of the groupies. It was a survival mechanism. If she embraced the lie, she did not have to face the terrifying, crushing reality of her lack of control. Mick Jagger watched this media campaign unfold with satisfaction. The machine was operating at peak efficiency. The personnel kept the physical perimeter secure. The financial arrangements kept the hotel staff quiet. And now, the music press had successfully sanitized the operation for public consumption. The reality had been successfully rebranded. The individual had been successfully labeled. The American tour continued its relentless march across the continent, generating millions of dollars, leaving a trail of exhausted youth in its wake, fully protected by the very journalists who were supposed to expose the truth. The Rolling Stones' American tour of 1972 was a massive, fast-moving operation. When the Los Angeles dates concluded, the crew packed up and the machinery prepared to relocate. The roadies packed the amplifiers into reinforced flight cases. The accountants settled the massive hotel bills. The logistics details cleared the perimeters. The operation prepared to relocate. For the organization, this was a standard logistical pivot. For the 15-year-old girl isolated in the penthouse suite, it was the abrupt, brutal termination of her inclusion. When the Los Angeles dates concluded and the tour prepared to move on, she was simply escorted out. Personnel guided her back through the hidden service routes. She was left on the streets of Los Angeles, abruptly returning to the harsh reality of the pavement after days of severe lifestyle and psychological pressure. Sable Starr stood in the blinding California sun. The physical shock was immediate. She had been kept in a dark, climate-controlled, intense environment for days. The natural light burned her eyes. The noise of the Los Angeles traffic was deafening. She was standing on the asphalt, entirely alone, carrying the psychological toll of a veteran combatant. But she was only 15 years old. She began to walk. The Sunset Strip was her only destination. It was the only ecosystem she knew. But returning to the street level after existing in the apex of the rock and roll hierarchy was a brutal psychological drop. In the penthouse, she had been shielded from the grit of the street by a team of handlers. The figures in the hotel suite wore tailored suits and drank imported champagne. The figures on the pavement lacked those velvet ropes. They were street-level opportunists and chaotic figures. She walked back into Rodney Bingenheimer's English disco. She walked back into the Rainbow Bar and Grill. The physical spaces were the same, but her relationship to them was permanently warped. This is where the media narrative inflicted its most severe damage. The journalists had crowned her the queen of the baby groupies. They had printed her name in glossy magazines. When she walked into the clubs, the other youths looked at her with awe. They saw a success story. They saw a girl who had breached the inner sanctum of the Rolling Stones. They wanted to know what Mick Jagger was like. They wanted to know what the penthouse looked like. Sable Starr was trapped in a cognitive dissonance designed by the press. She had been physically utilized and discarded like an obsolete asset. She was traumatized, exhausted, and abandoned. But the society inside those clubs demanded that she play the role of the triumphant insider. If she admitted the truth, if she confessed that she had been overwhelmed, secluded in a room, and treated as a disposable entity by a grown man, she would lose her status. She would just be another broken individual. She chose the armor the journalists had built for her. She leaned into the persona. She projected a highly exaggerated, untouchable arrogance. She wore the title of baby groupie as a shield. She fed the younger girls the stories they wanted to hear. She perpetuated the myth of the glamorous rock and roll lifestyle. She became an unwitting recruiter for the very system that had broken her. By maintaining the illusion of the queen, she ensured that the next wave of 14 and 15-year-old girls would willingly walk into the same service elevators. The internal pressure required a release. In the hotel suite, the habits had been heavily managed. Stimulants prepared on glass tables, pills handed out by tour associates. On the street, the environment was unstable. Sable Starr descended rapidly into the heavy, unforgiving currents of the Los Angeles scene. Without the tour financial shield, her situation devolved into severe street-level dependency. The habits were no longer a recreational enhancement. They were an anesthetic. She needed to numb the memory of the secluded rooms. She needed to silence the realization that her youth had been taken and consumed by adult men who faced zero consequences. A 15-year-old body is not built to withstand the toxic load of damaging habits. The physical deterioration began immediately. The magazines had photographed a fresh-faced teenager in trendy clothes. The reality on the street was hollow cheeks, severe physical distress, and the desperate daily grind of maintaining the dependency. The music industry observed this descent with absolute apathy. The club owners, the bouncers, the local record executives, they all saw the queen of the groupies struggling in their booths. They knew her age. They knew what the touring bands did to her. Nobody intervened. Nobody called welfare services. In the economy of the Sunset Strip, girls like Sable were viewed as a renewable resource. They were consumer goods. When one broke down from dependency and psychological trauma, there was always a fresh arrival seeking the same lifestyle. While Sable Starr fought for survival on the concrete of West Hollywood, Mick Jagger was airborne. The Rolling Stones tour moved eastward. They hit Dallas. They hit Chicago. They descended on New York City for a legendary run of shows at Madison Square Garden. The corporate machinery functioned flawlessly. The private jet touched down. The police escorts cleared the highways. The hotels were locked down. The entire process executed in Los Angeles was replicated in every major American market. This was the industrial scale of the manipulation. The invitation, the isolation, and the consumption of vulnerable young girls were not isolated incidents. They were standard operating procedures. The logistics teams in Chicago used the same service elevator tactics. The tour accountants in New York distributed the same financial arrangements to the hotel staff. The machine was a highly efficient interstate concealment network operating in plain sight, protected by the sheer volume of capital it generated. Crossing state lines to facilitate highly questionable situations is a severe violation of federal boundaries. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had the jurisdiction and the authority to dismantle the entire touring operation. They did not act. The federal government, much like the local police and the hotel managers, chose complicity. The Rolling Stones were generating massive taxable revenue. They were a cultural juggernaut. The federal authorities were not going to deploy agents to investigate the penthouse suite of the most famous band on the planet over the mistreatment of vulnerable youth. The justice system drew a clear line in the sand. Laws protecting youth applied to the general population. They did not apply to multimillionaires generating GDP. Jagger operated with total impunity. He gave press conferences in New York, smiling for the cameras, charming the reporters. He attended high society parties alongside politicians, authors, and the elite of the American upper class. He was insulated by wealth and protected by the very institutions designed to monitor men like him. He did not spend a single second thinking about the 15-year-old girl he had left on the pavement in California. He had already issued the orders to prepare for the next arrival for the New York suite. The divergence in their trajectories was absolute and brutal. The man who orchestrated the highly restrictive network was ascending to the highest echelons of global wealth and cultural untouchability. The youth who had been fed into the machinery was sinking into the gutter, her nervous system collapsing under the weight of heavy dependency and unacknowledged trauma. The media continued to print the myth. The Rolling Stone magazine issues hit the newsstands, featuring glowing reviews of the tour and edgy, stylish profiles of the rock and roll lifestyle. Millions of readers consumed the sanitized narrative. The American public bought the records and bought the tickets, completely unaware that they were financing an organization that treated young individuals as disposable commodities. The illusion was perfect. The cover-up was seamless. The reality of the painful, traumatic grind of the machine was buried beneath the deafening roar of the stadium crowds. The summer of 1972 rolled on, a season of unprecedented profit built on a foundation of silent, invisible distress. The decades that followed the summer of 1972 were defined by a massive, sustained campaign of historical erasure. The machine that had brought in, isolated, and utilized Sable Starr did not cease operations when the tour ended. It simply shifted its focus from physical concealment to narrative control. The music press, the record executives, and the corporate entities backing the Rolling Stones understood that the events of that summer represented a catastrophic legal and public relations liability. They had to sanitize the history. They had to ensure that the American public remembered the music and forgot the realities. This sanitization process was highly organized and incredibly lucrative. The magazines that had originally coined the term baby groupie began to publish retrospectives and coffee table books. They repackaged the grim reality of extreme manipulation as a golden era of rock and roll rebellion. They sold nostalgia. They printed glossy photographs of teenage girls standing outside concert venues, describing them as muses and pioneers of the Cultural Revolution. They completely omitted the service elevators, the secluded doors, the handlers, and the financial arrangements. The cultural establishment actively participated in this cover-up. Hollywood studios produced films set in the 1970s rock scene. They cast young, beautiful actresses to play these girls. They dressed them in vintage denim and played classic rock soundtracks over montages of tour buses and hotel parties. These films portrayed the girls as willing, empowered participants in a glamorous adventure. They deliberately erased the power imbalance. They erased the pressure. They erased the severe psychological damage inflicted by adult men exerting control over youth. The entertainment industry institutionalized the narrative because the truth was too harsh to monetize. Sable Starr was trapped beneath the weight of this fabricated history. She could not speak out. The media had already defined her legacy. If she attempted to tell the truth about the fear, the control, and the manipulation, she would be dismissed as a bitter, aging figure trying to cash in on her past. The system had successfully preempted any attempt at accountability by destroying her credibility before she even had a chance to speak. She was isolated. The trauma she carried was invisible to a society that refused to look. The physical and psychological toll of her experiences compounded rapidly. The human nervous system is not designed to process the level of manipulation and extreme lifestyle she endured as a teenager. The coping mechanism she developed on the Sunset Strip eventually failed. The habits that had once numbed the pain now began to destroy her biology. She realized that remaining in Los Angeles was a highly destructive path. The city was a graveyard of her stolen youth. Every street corner, every hotel facade, every club entrance was a trigger. She executed a desperate retreat. She fled the epicenter of the music industry and relocated to the harsh, unforgiving landscape of Nevada. She sought anonymity in the desert. Leaving Los Angeles was not a victory. It was a frantic evacuation. She traded the intense, overwhelming glare of the rock and roll hierarchy for the sterile, fluorescent anonymity of the casino floors. She found employment as a casino dealer. It was a brutal, grinding existence. She stood behind green felt tables for 8 hours a day, dealing cards to tourists, breathing in recycled air and stale cigarette smoke. She wore a name tag. She adhered to a strict dress code. She submitted to the rigid corporate surveillance of the gaming industry. The woman who had once been crowned the queen of the Sunset Strip was now a faceless gear in a massive gambling machine. This was the grim reality of the aftermath. There was no glamour in Nevada. There was only survival. She fought a daily, exhausting battle against the lingering shadows of dependency and the deep, untreated psychological wounds inflicted by the men who had used her. She lived a quiet, obscure life, deliberately avoiding the spotlight that had deeply harmed her. She married. She had children. She tried to build a conventional existence on top of a foundation that had been systematically shattered when she was 15 years old. But the past is never entirely inert. It waits. In the early 2000s, an oral history project focusing on the punk and rock scenes of the 1970s reached out to her. The authors were compiling interviews. They wanted her perspective. Sable Starr agreed to speak. She sat in front of a tape recorder and she told her story. She did not use the sanitized language of the magazines. She did not hide behind the persona of the baby groupie. She spoke with blunt, devastating clarity. She stated her exact age during those encounters. She explicitly detailed she was in hotel rooms with grown men. The words were recorded. The interviews were transcribed. The book was published and distributed globally. The reality was out in the open. The individual had spoken on the record, providing direct eyewitness testimony to her own experiences. She handed the American public the truth on a silver platter. The societal response was a chilling, absolute silence. The book became a bestseller. Critics praised its raw, unfiltered look at the music industry. People read her quotes, they saw the numbers, they did the math. They realized she was 15 and the men were pushing 30, and nobody did anything. No prosecutors opened an investigation. No authorities requested the interview tapes. No child advocacy groups issued statements of condemnation. The public consumed her story as entertainment and turned the page. The statute of limitations had expired. The legal system had successfully run out the clock. The law is designed with arbitrary deadlines that protect influential figures who are powerful enough to hide their actions for a few decades. By the time Sable Starr felt safe enough to state the facts, the American justice system had formally moved past the men who had damaged her. The apathy of the public was the final crushing blow. It proved that the cover-up had been a total success. The culture had been so thoroughly conditioned to accept the myth of the rock star that they could read a direct admission of systematic manipulation and feel absolutely no moral outrage. The powerful figures had won. They had committed the acts, they had kept the money, and they had successfully trained society to look the other way. While Sable Starr was dealing cards under the harsh lights of a Nevada casino, Mick Jagger was ascending to the absolute pinnacle of global power and wealth. His trajectory was a masterclass in corporate evolution. The Rolling Stones ceased to be a mere rock band. They transformed into a multinational conglomerate. Jagger was the chief executive officer. He hired armies of lawyers, financial advisors, and crisis management firms. He diversified his assets. He invested heavily in publishing rights, real estate, and corporate sponsorships. He understood that wealth was the ultimate shield. A man with $1 million can buy a good lawyer. A man with $500 million can buy his own reality. Jagger's net worth skyrocketed. He became untouchable. He moved through the world in a bubble of extreme privilege. He traveled on private jets, bypassing commercial airports and customs checkpoints. He resided in heavily fortified estates in London, New York, and the Caribbean. He was completely insulated from the daily struggles of the working class and entirely immune to the consequences of his past actions. The establishment that had once viewed him as a dangerous countercultural threat now embraced him as an economic pillar. The banking institutions that financed his massive global tours did not care about the teenagers isolated in hotel rooms in 1972. They cared about the gross revenue. The corporate sponsors who plastered their logos on his stadium stages did not care about the human cost of his fame. They cared about the demographic reach. Jagger had successfully integrated himself into the highest levels of the capitalist machine. The ultimate validation of his power occurred in 2003. The British monarchy, the institution that represents the pinnacle of tradition, law, and social order, decided to officially honor him. Mick Jagger walked into Buckingham Palace. He stood before the Prince of Wales. He knelt on a velvet stool. A ceremonial sword was tapped upon his shoulders. He rose as Sir Michael Philip Jagger. He was knighted for his services to popular music. It was a moment of profound, sickening irony. The state apparatus had officially validated him. The British Empire placed a crown of respectability upon the head of a man who had operated a transnational network of concealment. The knighthood washed away the history of the Sunset Strip. It provided him with an impenetrable armor of aristocratic legitimacy. When a government knights a highly controversial figure, it sends a clear, undeniable message to those affected. It tells them that their suffering is irrelevant. It tells them that if a powerful figure generates enough capital and cultural influence, the state will not only ignore his actions, it will reward him. Sable Starr did not live to see any form of acknowledgement. The heavy lifestyle of her youth, combined with the severe, unrelenting stress of carrying a traumatic secret, exacted a final fatal toll on her biology. She was diagnosed with brain cancer. The disease aggressively attacked her central nervous system. The tumors grew in the same mind that held the memories of the secluded rooms, the service elevators, and the silent, complicit handlers. She spent her final days in a hospital bed in Nevada. She was surrounded by her immediate family, but she was entirely isolated from the industry that had consumed her. There were no reporters camped outside her room. There were no statements of support from the record labels. There were no financial contributions from the multimillionaires who had utilized her presence to pass the time between stadium gigs. She faced the end of her life in quiet obscurity. Sable Starr died on April 18, 2009. She was 51 years old. She took her last breath far away from the glamour of Los Angeles. Her passing was noted by a few brief obituaries in the music press, the very same publications that had orchestrated her downfall. They referred to her using the old poisonous terminology. They called her a famous groupie. Even in death, the media refused to grant her the dignity of the truth. They refused to acknowledge the reality. They buried her under the same narrative they had invented in 1972. The contrast between these two lives is the ultimate indictment of the modern world. One individual is interred in a quiet grave in the Nevada desert, her life cut short by disease and the long-term devastation of childhood manipulation. The other individual resides in palaces, his chest adorned with medals, his bank accounts holding $500 million, his legacy protected by a massive corporate and legal infrastructure. The story of the 1972 American tour is not a celebration of rock and roll. It is a detailed autopsy of a systemic failure. It exposes the exact mechanism by which wealth and fame can override the fundamental boundaries of human decency. It demonstrates how a sophisticated organization can incorporate a youth, transport her across state lines, seclude her in a hotel suite, and utilize her for the benefit of an adult male, all while the police stand guard outside and the press writes glowing reviews. The lack of any consequence is the most terrifying aspect of this history. Mick Jagger never faced a detective in an inquiry room. He never sat at a defense table in a courtroom. He never answered a single question under oath regarding the 15-year-old girl in his penthouse. The Los Angeles Police Department did nothing. The authorities did nothing. The district attorneys did nothing. This absolute inaction strips away the illusion of a blind justice system. It proves that the law is not a universal shield designed to protect the vulnerable. The law is a porous membrane. It catches the poor, the unconnected, and the weak, but it allows the wealthy, the famous, and the powerful to pass through with complete impunity. When a society allows a 29-year-old multi-millionaire to move a 15-year-old youth through the service elevators of a luxury hotel and then rewards that same man with a knighthood and endless adulation, that society has lost its moral authority. The silence of the legal system is not a glitch. It is the intended design. It is the brutal, undeniable proof that when you have enough money, enough influence, and enough lawyers, the ethical boundaries protecting youth are nothing more than scrap paper.